Welcome, welcome. Come up to the front. We're having a conversation amongst friends today. Hello, Amanda. Thank you so much, Amanda, for please come to the front. All we're having a quite intimate discussion about the future of the workforce and the just transition. So exactly. By the end of this session, we should know everyone's name in the room. Please come to the front. But you know it. But we'll never know because they're on the wrong. You have to get them on the other side of the camera angle.
I think you're nearly safe.
Yeah.
Everybody in the room, technicians outside of the table.
Amanda, I don't know if you, Stephen Cotton, Amanda Birano. Hey, good to see you. Berto Di Preto from IRU, Sheila. And Amanda is the chair of the National Infrastructure Planning Board for Uganda. And a longtime friend. So we're still waiting for the last bus before 9 o'clock. I suggest we probably start this about 5 minutes off, so 9:05, and then we'll have a nice conversation with our panelists. We've kept an empty chair because we'll also ask for some of you at some point to come up if you so want. But you did come to the best session on Friday morning in Leipzig, so congratulations for that.
We think we might have to get a prize for next year.
Yeah. Please come to the front. We have a fascinating conversation that's about to take place. Hey, Jens. Welcome, come to the front. We have a very interesting conversation that will take place. As I said, we'll start in about 5 minutes. Give time to people to filter in. Hello, please come to the front. Welcome, you made the right choice. Welcome. Plenty of room close to the front.
You might do a song out there, and then
Yeah. Thank you for coming this morning. For those of you who are...
your friend.
Yeah, I just did. For those of you who are on the dance floor at 1 o'clock in the morning, thank you ever so much. All right. Alles gut? Super. All right. Another few minutes for the people to filter up. We're keeping count. Ah. Is buying a beer ever losing, though? That's the question. Everyone wins in that scenario. Super. All right. There's some more people. Was there anyone in the room that was up until 1 o'clock in the morning on the dance floor? Yeah? So I do have. Okay, so that's what I want to ask. This is an informal, not the OG ITF, but the organizing ITF questionnaire. How many people who were there at 1 o'clock in the morning were happy with the DJ? Okay, I see something. Welcome. Oh, please come to the front. So those of you who were not happy with the DJ, you may know or may not know that tonight in Leipzig, Depeche Mode is playing. So, so there will be a drawing. There will be a drawing for a free ticket at the end of the session. Well, I was kind of hoping for the social program that we'd have a remake of Oasis instead of the faux Beatles. All right, so I said we'd start at 9:05. Another 3 minutes for the people in the bus to come up. I'm looking to Marcio. Is that okay to start at 9:05? Okay, super. There are only two people at this summit that really matter, and they're both right there, Magda and Marcio. So nothing happens without them. Please come to the front. Bonjour. Alors you, I know you weren't there till 1 in the morning. Please, there. We will at one point activate the hot seat, and so some of you may be called to the hot seat if you have. So very quickly, all of you who are in the room, you don't have to listen to this, but just for our panelists, the microphones are on. They will ramp up when you start speaking, and just hold them below your chin, right, exactly. All right, I think that another minute, we should be able to start. I'm looking at the room. Yep. Up front, sit. You lead the lesson today. You did make the right choice. Please come in. Yes, exactly. We're only waiting for you. Yes. Wonderful. We are ready to start. So, thank you all for coming. Thank you all equally, but thank you especially for those who are up at 1 in the morning for coming. We're going to talk about a serious topic, one that will affect us, of course, that will affect future generations. Now, you know, of course, from what we have heard, what is generally out in the discourse, that we have to change our economies to a model that is more sustainable, environmentally sustainable, but as well socially sustainable. Now, the title for this session is A Just Transition to Net Zero, Focus on the Transport Workforce. I feel as if it's a bingo of all the important words that we need to be thinking of. Just, a transition to net zero, the transport workforce, without which this transition cannot take place, but a workforce that will be challenged because of a number of new skills, new types of work, and new ways of working that we will all have to, and the transport workforce in particular will have to adopt. So that is the topic of this session today. We'll be thinking about the ways in which this transition can provide opportunities for the workforce to participate in stimulating greater economic prosperity, more equitable distribution of economic prosperity, and to make sure that this transition to net zero doesn't leave anyone behind. Now, for those of you who know history, there have been many transitions in transport, many transitions in the economy, and unfortunately, when these transitions take place, there are those who are left behind. We can and we must do better. And so this is what we'll be talking about today. We'll have to think about the kinds of skills that will be necessary. We'll be having to talk about the ways in which people acquire those skills. We'll be having to talk about the changing nature of work. And we'll be having to talk about how to bring in as many people into this workforce so that the representation in the transport workforce is the same representation as in society in general. We'll be looking at effective policies to promote low-carbon solutions that also address these crucial workforce issues. And today, to do that, we have a brilliant panel of 4 speakers who conversationalists, because we are going to have a conversation. I will introduce them to you briefly, and then we will start with a few questions. I will very quickly turn to you, because you have made the effort to come here, to ask you questions, but also if you have a particularly burning point that you would like to make, to invite you to the hot seat, which will be on camera as the camera roves around, and you'll have a very brief moment in which you can make this point and ask the panel to react to that. But I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. We have Amanda Gabirano here. Amanda is the chairperson for the Ugandan National Physical Planning Board. And this is the highest body in Uganda responsible for physical planning in the country. She is the former Vice President Africa of the World Cycling Alliance. She's an urban and regional planner. She is a lecturer at Nakere University in Kampala. She is a keen observer and an effective shaper of future cities in Uganda and beyond. She's a dear friend. Thank you, Amanda, for being here. She brings a deep commitment to and enthusiasm for better mobility for all, and you have particular insights in how this transition will affect, of course, the workforce in Uganda and neighboring countries. We also have Umberto Di Preto. He is the Secretary General for the IRU. The IRU is the World Transport Organization. It represents the entire industry, bus, coach, truck, and taxi, and the organization drives the sustainable mobility of people and goods across the planet. Your vision at IRU is that the IRU will lead the road transport industry in embracing innovation and ensuring that the industry is ready for the challenges that are ahead, the challenges that I mentioned, the challenges that we're going to discuss today. Sheila Watson is Deputy Director of the FIA Foundation, a UK-based charity that is committed to promoting safe, sustainable mobility across the world. Sheila, you lead the foundation's work on environmental and sustainability issues, clean air and gender, as well as the FIA Foundation's research program. For those of you who were here yesterday, there's a report that just came out funded by FIA, the PATH report on cycling and walking, active mobility. I recommend that you look at those and the other reports that FIA Foundation has been involved in. She also a good friend. You were recently named as one of the 40 most influential women in transport by the German government. So high bar here. We expect a lot from Sheila.
I think pretty much every woman at ITN's been on.
And Stephen Cotton. Stephen, you are the General Secretary of the OG ITF, the original ITF, the International Transport Workers Federation, not to be confused with the International Transport Forum, not to be confused with the International Tennis Federation, and I think 3 others.
Taekwondo is one of them.
Yeah. But certainly, and I don't think I'm going out on a limb and saying not only the oldest, but probably the most influential one of these organizations. You represent the federation of almost 670 trade unions, 18 million workers, 154 countries. If it happens in transport, it happens because of the people that you represent. And so we're delighted to have you here in this discussion. Under your leadership as General Secretary, the ITF has transformed itself into a proactive, campaigning organization allowing the ITF, the OG ITF. From now on, when we say the ITF, it will be the International Transport Workers Federation. And its affiliates to secure industry-leading contracts and protocols with key multinational companies in the transport sector, including aviation, maritime, and road transport. You have a particular background in maritime transport, which you may not know we share, because I also worked on a ferry boat and a tugboat back in the day. So these are our panelists. Again, welcome to all of you, because you will be participating in this conversation. But very quickly, I'd like to ask a first question to all of our panelists to provide some input to help frame the discussion that we're about to have. And that is, I talked about the change that we know is necessary. I talked about the scale of the challenge that we face. I'm going to ask you to give me, very briefly, a hot take on what it is what is the major feeling you see the transport workforce as having to face in the next few years with respect to the just transition, but even more broadly with other changes in society. Can you tell us, Umberto, I'll start with you, what are the key factors that you feel the transport workforce will be facing as we undergo this transition? Hello?
Hello, hello. Yeah,
you
there
go.
we go. Now we hear bigger than life. This panel is very interesting because it really addresses what we see as the 3D challenges, all three of them. Digitalization and in terms of how we're going to go forward. If we don't have proper digitalization, there are a lot of things we will not be able to accomplish, and we'll get back to that in the conversation. But our second big D challenge is driver shortage. So we're talking about how do we make sure that the workforce is able to integrate into this and have a just transition with net zero, but you need a workforce. And if we look at transport, everything that is carried, everything in this room, if we look around, has been on a truck at some point in its production and distribution. But then if you don't have people to carry those goods, then you have a big, big issue on your hands. If we look at the numbers, we see that there are about 3.5 million drivers missing in the world, 3.5 million drivers, and by 2028, it should reach 7.7 million with the current path we're following. And that's mainly because we have about 1/3 of the workforce that's 55. They're going to be retiring, and we only have 7% that's under 25 years old. So this is going to be a huge problem. So we're talking about net zero. How do we transition it? But with who? We need to bring drivers in, and that's where we have the whole issue of digitalization and how do we actually attract young drivers, how do we attract women into this profession, how do we then change immigration policies? And we just passed a resolution 2 weeks ago, and we're working with the ITF, to make sure that we can work with governments, and firstly at global level, working with the UN to have a framework for proper immigration so that we don't let's say, degrade the level of safety. So we not only bring it up, but even bring it to a higher standard than what we are today. And then working with national governments to get rid of the bureaucracy to bring these workers in. And then, of course, the transport companies to make sure they can integrate these immigrants to make sure we have a workforce. But then I get to the third D, and that's decarbonization. And that's going to be a huge challenge with this workforce that is depleting, and how do we bring them into this? The frustration in all of this, and just before we walked in here, we were speaking about COP, and all the conversations are, oh, but you guys are the problem, and yet at the COP, transport is hardly addressed. If we're such a problem, then make it one of the main themes at the COP so that we can actually address transport. If it is a problem, let's find the solution. And the moment you identify the problem, the solution is easy to find, but then you need to talk about it and see what are the different steps. But the frustrating part in this whole decarbonization debate is the fact that we have low-hanging fruits. If we train our drivers, and a very simple training, and using our Roadmasters program that we have, not only do we up their skills and actually make them feel more involved in their tasks, but one, we can reduce road accidents by training them, but also reduce CO2 emissions by 15%. And then there's the absolute no-brainer solution. A few years back, we came here to Leipzig, and we put out front two vehicles. One was a 25.25 meter truck, which was a modular concept, or what we call an eco truck. So you have the tractor and then two trailers. And then we had a city bus, which is also 25.25 meters long. Because the governments were saying, oh, but we can't bring these big trucks, these big monster trucks into the cities. Yes, you can. If a bus fits, so will a truck. And by doing this, you can reduce your emissions by 1/3. You take 1/3 of the trucks off the road. And if we're looking at the fact that we don't have so many drivers, you need to find a better way to move all of these goods. So at the end, how do we have a just transition to net zero? Firstly, let's make sure our drivers are trained so that they can maximize the ability of a vehicle to reduce those emissions. And then we have a whole bunch of other things we can be doing, but start with the easy ones. And make sure that when they come into the workforce that we then have proper treatment of these workers. And we can get back into that and how technology can help on that in terms of waiting times at borders, secure parking areas, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll leave it at that as a starter.
Several things that come to mind. So I have this vision of a big poster, MIA, missing in action, drivers. That's one of the things we're facing. But the training aspect is really important because when we have those come into the workforce, they need to be trained for maybe a broadening set of skills and different types of technologies. Last thing, I grew up in Tennessee. When we think of monster trucks, I'm thinking of big wheels crushing cars. Very different idea of what the monster truck is. Amanda, I'd like to turn to you. Now, in Uganda, we talk about a just transition to net zero, but there are many countries, Uganda being one, where the transport system is actually much nearer to net zero than in many other countries. And so I wonder, when you hear us talk about the transition to net zero as if that's something that we have to create, what does that mean in your mind about a country and a region where a lot of what happens in transport is actually fairly low carbon? How do you see the changes in the workforce as we try to retain that, I would say, beneficial environment and CO2 performance going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Philip. And I think that this is very timely for a country like Uganda, because we have an unjust system, to say, because it's not accepted, but it is working. Like I mentioned yesterday, it's serving the public, it's running the city, it's running places. People are very creative, the drivers, the owners, the stage managers, they have their own small leadership. But I think they are not getting back what they should be getting. To me, I think they are subsidizing the government because they are providing a public service, transportation, but they are not getting that. And I see that the main challenge is that their service is not appreciated the way it should. Although everybody likes to use it because that's what is running, but they are not appreciated. I remember in some meetings, the young men who run those services, in the informal public transport, were complaining.
These are the boda boda.
Yeah, boda bodas, the 14-seaters, the minibus taxis. They said, everybody is calling us boys. We are men, we have wives, we have children, we have families, we need respect. So the users also don't respect them, but they use them. The regulators think that they need to force them to behave in a certain way, and that is government. And there's a huge gap between them and government. But they have a very close connection between the users and themselves, between spaces, places, more than government does. So there's a very big gap between them and government. And right now, like he mentioned, they are scared of so many things that are coming up. The pressure to provide a better service, the apps coming up, digitalization, users preferring a formal setup than the informal establishment, and the pressure for them to adjust so fast and become perfect so fast, It's something that I see is exerting a lot of pressure. For instance, the minibus taxi operators and drivers are very worried when they hear the BRT coming up. They don't know how this bus rapid transit will affect their jobs. Each 14-seater has about 5 families. The owner, the driver, the conductor who receives the money, the stage manager, it's a chain. And those are 4 or 5 families per one minibus taxi. So they ask questions, how will this bus take away our jobs? How shall we live? And nobody is giving them those answers. So they have a lot of pressure to adjust and do fleet recapitalization, which I see as a challenge where they will need some justice as we transition. I like the name of the topic of this discussion, just transition. And they are trying to get loans to replace their fleet, the small vehicles to buses, because they want to fill in the gap quickly before the BRT comes. And yes, we can also provide the bus services that they want and remain in business. So they look at the profit side, that's the owner perspective, but there's the employment side from the other 3, 4 that benefit from public transport, but also the users as well. How can they make their users happy? You see, some of them are introducing Wi-Fi in the informal van, and I think it's good for them, but there's a lot of pressure, and there are no initiatives to prepare them, apart from what we started 2.5 years ago, that, hey, you need to position yourselves as well. Don't just be comfortable and run the public transport system the way it is. Kampala is not going to remain like this for the next 30 years. The system will definitely have to change. How ready are you to fit in the system? But we are also talking to government to support them, to invite them, initiate knowledge exchange, listen to them, and make sure that they are part of the planning process. That is, I think, a good step that we are taking. And there's the power gap has been reduced so far. There's interaction. There was elitism of the formal and informal, tension, I should call it. The providers are scared to even sit with government. Just a small example. The meetings we usually have are in a formal setting, something like this. But sometimes they don't appear because the way they dress is according to how they do their work. You don't expect them to come in suits. And so they said, no, we are more comfortable downtown in our places. So we adjusted the meeting place to them. But how many government officials are ready to provide such an opportunity that go to them? I mean, that should be a just way of preparing them to a better transportation system. The women, this is my last one on this, the gender aspect is very strong because they are treated as failures, desperate people in public transport operation because it's regarded as a man's job. So if they see you operating even trucks, buses, it's something that looks abnormal. They will even stare for long compared to when it's a man operating it. So we have very few women in this, and it could be an opportunity for women to also get employed and provide a service. We've seen that the few women in public transport are preferred by the passengers. For some reason, they prefer female drivers. I don't know why, but I can imagine. Maybe we'll hear from the audience if Felipe allows us later. And there are also other natural issues. Along the trip, long journeys, maybe 50 kilometers, people would like to use the washrooms, and the men are more comfortable than women. So the men just stand somewhere by the roadside, and the women will hold on to it until they get a convenient place. So this is also something we are discussing for health reasons. It's not just, how can we make it attractive that a woman can stop somewhere and feel, freshen up and feel new, and with the privacy that she deserves. So this is also one angle, but also the working hours are quite long, and sometimes the families are broken. If she takes so long on a trip and she's expected at home, she can't pick calls, she can't do anything, she's on the road. And it's something that I see, it's an opportunity to learn from here, and this concept of the just transition, net zero.
Can I just jump in on that?
Of course.
Really quickly. The boys who are men, okay, if you can send a message
Also
back
a
to
band.
them. Sorry?
Also a band.
Boys to men.
Boys to men.
Boys to men. Boys to men. No,
Were
no.
they playing last night? That's the question.
But the more to the point of boys who are.
We go from Depeche Mode to... You need to give them a message, please, when you go back. 2 weeks ago, at the IRU General Assembly, we gave an award called the Grand Prix d'Honneur that we normally give to a driver that has committed a heroic act to usually save the lives of someone. Tell them that the IRU has awarded the IRU Grand Prix d'Honneur to all drivers because they're all heroes. Very quickly we forget, during COVID, we had our medicine, we had our food, they were out, we were trying to stay safe, they were out getting everything delivered, okay? When the war broke out in Ukraine, they were the first ones there with buses saying, how do we get the refugees out? They were bringing all supplies in. During the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey, they were the first ones there to help out, always risking their lives. They're not men, they're not women, they're heroes. Yeah. Tell them they're heroes, please, on behalf of the RU. They need respect. And I'm sure Stephen will agree with me. These men and women need respect, complete respect from us, and recognition of the work that they do every single day to make our lives what they are.
Yeah.
Excellent point. I think we've had two speakers already give some overview, and there's a lot to unpack here. I'm going to turn to the audience after we hear from our last two speakers. So if you have some questions already to what you've heard, then after we've heard from both Stephen and Sheila, we'll turn to you immediately. I just want to say, Amanda, among the many things that you bring up, there is this notion not only of respect, but of the different structure of a workforce that is informal or popular transport, to the kind of workforce that your unions represent, which is workers in a more formalized work setting. Many, as you pointed out, of the operators that are operating minibuses, bodas are actually entrepreneurs themselves and create work. And so there's a great number of micro enterprises in Uganda and a lot of places where there's a lot of popular transport. But as that formality comes into place, which you say is probably inevitable to a certain extent, then the work relation will change because these people, from being auto entrepreneurs and running their organizations, will become workers that need representation, workers that have to access rights through negotiation and sometimes through industrial action. So Stephen, I want to turn to you and ask, we've heard two takes on what are the key things that some of our panelists think will shape the future workforce as we undergo this just transition, and the transition being the key word. Your focus is, of course, on just and making sure that whatever happens, it is fair for those who are providing the work that, as Umberto says, is essential. How do you see the major changes in the workforce taking place in the next few years?
Thanks, Philip. So a number of fantastic and quite wide and diverse comments. I think if we want to capture both the global north and the global south, and Amanda, you touched on many of the things that we'll echo, I think for working people there's a sense of fear that we haven't clearly identified, whether it's formal or informal, what is a good green job. So our first job was communicating with our members, and we started in urban transport. We've now got a very sustainable project in maritime, and we're looking at civil aviation. But the reality is we don't just represent formalised workers. We represent one of our biggest road transport unions is in Uganda, and we'll be in Uganda in July, so I'm going to ask to meet you around that time with the whole of our African Union movement. So I think for us, the first question is fear, and then we have to define what does fear look like. So if you're in the global north, it's a job that you've had for 30 years and you hear the combination of a green job linked with technology. Now, we agree with Umberto that digitalisation is part of the solution. I think the fundamental question, and it doesn't matter whether you're north or south, is how do you get to the table? And it was a brilliant example of downtown in Town Hall. It's not any less intimidating if you're a union activist in DC, Washington, DC, or somewhere else. It's just an environment where working people believe have the power before you sit in the room. So how do we redress that balance? How do we clarify the argument? So in the ITF, the original ITF, 1896, quite old at that stage, hopefully with some maturity.
FYI.
How do we engage? And again, we are a union movement, so we work with mandates and committees and direction, but these issues are very difficult to get mandates because it's a little bit scary. So I think for us, we've been quite bold. We think we should sit at the table, and Umberto and I, for the millions that are watching us, probably consider ourselves friends, because through the pandemic, we decided that coalition of the willing was the only way forward. And we believe that's now part of this conversation. We won't agree on everything, and industrially workers will always have disagreements with employers. But we believe it's fundamental that we build a coalition of the willing that clearly explain to working people, wherever they fit, urban transport, freight forwarding, civil aviation, shipping, which has got a terrible reputation when it comes to pollution, that we have to have a conversation about why we have to be at the table. And that's because we believe ultimately the next question is, the system we had before we needed to change for climate change was not very good. Transportation is too cheap, We haven't made it attractive. Of course, ITF is incredibly strong advocating for women to be part of the transport supply chain when it comes to labour, but we seriously have to look at the environment. We just heard a perfect example of why bus conductors or drivers, I can give you an opinion why women drivers, they're considered safer, more rational, more composed in that process. So passengers are more likely. If you know, in the urban centres in the global north, many women drivers, many women drivers on locomotives, some of the best drivers. So the question for us is, how do we make it more appealing? And then the big question, where I think there's a lot of collaborative work, is why would you be a transport worker now? And that, for the policymakers, has to be part of their question. And you mentioned it, and we were muttering about it outside, so let's just put it out there. COP doesn't really recognise that transport, which is considered one of the worst polluters, cannot function without human beings. And if it can't function without human beings, how do we bring them into the debate? So there's responsibility on us, but government, but also employers groups. And frankly, we found more common ground through the pandemic with employers groups than with governments. And probably we would say UN agencies don't have enough power to translate all the good words and all the good policies that come out into concrete things. And if they do, there's no enforcement mechanisms. So I think for us, and it's just one last thing, and two things, forgive me. The question about how do we change this is, again, building the coalition of the willing, defining what tomorrow's transport worker looks like without alienating today's transport worker. That's not an easy task. But that can only come if we build a model of collaboration. We have examples in the ITF of what we call safe rates for freight trucking, which emanates from Australia, where there is a history of owner-operators being represented by unions. That means you have to have some regulatory framework where you can guarantee an income. Because, of course, if we look at North America and we look at others, and I was on a very interesting conversation yesterday about electric vehicles. So there's an enormous leap here. You will not be able to secure electric vehicles unless you secure a rate that the driver or the haulage company can make money and fund. That's without the challenges of infrastructure to provide the levels of energy that we need to charge trucks around the world. So for us, it's like, let's have that conversation, because one without the other won't work. And then the last point, the most significant point, and again, this is aimed at governments. We have ambitious words. We sit in beautiful locations, meet wonderful people, but actually we don't turn that into concrete outcomes. And some of the work we're doing with our partners from the employer side have concrete. I'll come to maritime in a moment, not this moment. Sorry, Sheila. But the reality is, the big question is, we hear about trillions of dollars. Where is it? Who's got it? How are we going to distribute it? And what are the concrete steps that make sure the various stakeholders have a say how it's spent? So that's the big issue. We can talk, it's not attractive anymore, we need to make it attractive. We can come up with answers for that. We can make it a more gender-friendly place. We can make young people be interested. But if governments don't back the numbers with concrete plans, sounds like good ideas that won't be delivered. Thank
Absolutely. Again, a lot of things to unpack there, and we will get to specifically this question of actually how do we make action happen in this area. Sheila, among the many hats that you wear, you also help lead the Global Fuel Economy Initiative. This is an initiative looking at reducing, shifting away from fossil fuels for vehicles, and also thinking about what is that future ecosystem, energy ecosystem going to look like in transport. Now, that's not the only hat you wear, but I'm saying that because I'm asking you, with that perspective, with a change in technology, with a change in fuels, with a change in the underlying ecosystem that supports transport, the vehicles, the energy infrastructure, et cetera, what are some of the major changes you think will be happening in the transport workforce, not just those driving, but those maintaining, those providing energy for those vehicles? What are some of your ideas of what the changes are that we can expect?
Thanks, Philippe. I mean, everyone has made such very interesting and very relevant comments. To add, I mean, I think you can't divorce the fact that people who work in the sector also live in the world. And I think there's a lot of fear being generated around the change that we're facing and need to address. I think we've accepted we all know we need to go forward being more sustainable. So let's say that is a broad level of acceptance in this room. But I think we all have to try and understand is just how frightening that is on the ground, living your life, and then also in your work. So even if you're receiving kind of some sort of level of reinforcing reassurance in work, you're not seeing that in many other places in the rest of your life. And I think for particularly people working in the transport sector where jobs are not well remunerated, where there is already insecurity, a great deal of insecurity actually, and where there are shortages of employees, you know, there's a lot to worry about already, to put no finer point on it. I mean, the perspective that we've been taking is a broad one. You're right, we're looking at how those transitions should take place around vehicles in a relatively technical way, but we're also, as you indicated earlier, looking really hard at how the vulnerable groups come through this transition. And you made the point, we've been through a few before, there's always one group that come out okay, but the vulnerable groups never do. Mm-hmm. And we can repeat all of that again, and in some ways make it much worse. I mean, there are real risks in the Global South about extraction, about labour, about the way in which people are treated in this transition and who wins, and how governments react. I mean, the bioethanol issues around Brazil, where the whole country turned to making fuel and forgot about feeding people because that was where the money lay, is a real threat and a real reminder that the signals we send about where we want to go can really affect other parts of the world. So vulnerable groups like that. As you know, we focus a lot on gender. I mean, the sector is pretty gender balanced at the moment, 17% of the workforce women. And, you know, that's not just about fairness. It's about it's about missing out on great skills, missing out on great drivers. I have an excellent anecdote. My father-in-law was not amazed by the fact that I worked for the Foreign Secretary of the UK. And that she was a great woman, and she did all these foreign secretary type things. He was amazed because she could pull her caravan on the wrong side of the road in France, and she was allowed to drive. And that was the thing that he says, mate, she said, oh, God, that's amazing. I mean, a silly anecdote in many ways, but you know, this kind of idea that it's not a sector for us does run deep. And you know, we can talk about the many ways in which we need to try and address that. We just published a report on that this week, and it's everything from the top to the bottom. 64 transport ministers are in the ITF, 7 are women. 66, forgive me, we've been using the wrong figure all week, but that makes it worse if only 7 are women. Your percentage gets worse. But yes, so, you know, from the very top, decision makers right the way through, and we've worked with organisations in different parts of the world to talk to women about what they want to see in the services they use. Women use public transport more than men, and they want to see women drivers who might be more compassionate to the case of abuse, which 90-odd% of them had experienced, and 90-odd% of them didn't even report because they didn't think it would be taken seriously. So there are lots of reasons why not having enough women in the sector is a detriment to the sector. The transition runs the risk of making that worse. Technology is a male-dominated industry too. You know, some of the leading lights in this transition are not the best examples of appreciation of the balance between our genders.
That was quite diplomatic.
I said that as discreetly as I could. So we've got to think about that. Yeah. Now is the time to take advantage of the opportunity to make all of these things better. So I agree with your opening point. And as I say, there was a range of very specific things, many of which have been mentioned by my colleagues here. So, you know, that I think is the rich toolbox from which we take. But The first one, and the only one I'll point to at this point before I'm sure you want to move on, is data. We don't count anything in a way which really enables us to understand how to make it better. So starting off with data collection, using technology, for example, in a way it can really help us with that. So we understand how women move, and then we can tailor services better to them. And indeed, we understand more about what our female workforce needs. The simplest things. It's always the simplest things. And build them in. You know, for example, it's not just an issue of discomfort not going to the loo, it's an issue of health. You know, UTIs follow and they're not nice. So I've heard of companies that have organised with hotels, that as the buses pass by, the bus can stop and the woman can use the facilities of local organisations or whatever that have got them. So it can be fixed, you know, it's always simple things. But it's very important. That's enough to put anyone off wanting to be a bus driver, I think.
Again, we've had our four panelists have spoken. There's so much to unpack there. I am retaining two things that I'd like to immediately come back to after we ask the audience for some reactions as well. And the first is that when there is change, I think many of you, most of you, have picked up on the fear of workers, fear of those involved in the industry, of what that change means to them. So after we have a first round with the audience, I'd like to come back to that and talk about hope. You know, where is it that you can point out good examples of how positive things can be both presented and taken up by the transport workforce. And then a second point, and Sheila, you and Amanda, well, all of you, in fact, hit on this. There's some really deep structural issues here that extend way beyond the transport sector, but that intersect with the transport sector. And so it's a bit like the tail wagging the dog. We can only do so much in the transport sector to address some of these deep structural issues. It doesn't mean we shouldn't, but how do we then make the link to other sectors, health, education, et cetera, to make sure that we try to address these structural changes? I said I was going to turn to the audience. Again, thank you for all of you. I have to say that I've already won a bet. And so for that, I thank you. But I also want to thank you by turning to you right now and seeing if you've heard from our four speakers already. And I'd like to see if you also have some ideas about the future of the of the nature of transport work and of the transport workforce against this backdrop of a just transition. So raise of hands, just so I can get a sense of how many people. So I see two, and there's absolutely no one behind me, so I don't need to look that way. So two people. All right, then if we can have the microphone to these two people, and I ask that you address your questions, please no statements, to the panelists, so that they can also come back and have an opportunity to bring some of their wisdom. Two, yeah, so I saw two, 1 and 2, and 3. No, 3, okay, 3, and then I'll hold it at these 3. But again, after this next round of questions, we'll come back to the audience for you to ask your questions. So please.
I'm not sure whether this is the right moment. I have something to say. I will stop with the question, but it takes 1.5 minutes.
Right now the question, and maybe later the statement.
So.
Okay. And then we have a question back here. Again, question to our panelists on what they've heard, what you've heard from them.
Good morning. I'm a Romanian trade unionist. I'm from the European Economic and Social Committee in the workers group, and I have questions for Mr. Cotton, our comrade from ITF, but also for Mr. De Preto, regarding our relationship of the trade union, of the workers, for example, of the workers in general, with online platforms. It's a big debate in many countries, as we know, and in Bolt, Uber, wherever, and we try to understand which will be the future from this perspective, at least for those which are working in this field of activity, the bargaining processes and so on, the governance. The main issue for us is the governance issue, because sometimes the government are not really prepared to deal with this kind of issues. And the second question is related to the capacity of the governments to drive policies for skills in the railway sectors. We have a big issue in the railway sectors because we cannot prepare the new generation of engine drivers in this field. Thank you very much.
Excellent questions. I'm going to ask for the other question to come in, and we'll take these 3. I'll just say that what you're underlining in your first question is the changing nature of employment relations. And so how does that progress under the just transition? All right.
Hi, good morning. So you already mentioned the topic on fear, and you also mentioned that there's hope, and I would also like to ask about your opinion on trust. How can we foster trust between decision makers and people in the field? Yesterday we were having drinks and I was talking to some of the people doing the logistics, and they said, yeah, those people here during the discussions, they think they are better than us, but now they're also having drinks. Actually, they're also normal people. I think it was a little bit like a wake-up call that we can also say, okay, how can we effectively communicate with people so they trust that the strategies and the visions that we are discussing here are actually also good for them?
There's the question of trust, the question of the changing nature of work, nature of employment relations. Some takes on those questions in the context of changing to a net zero economy. Yep, Umberto?
Maybe I start and then I'll give the floor to Stephen on it, but what actually got us two working together right away, we said,
there is some level of trust here.
There is. I mean, and it just started with a meeting. It just started with a meeting, getting to know each other, and basically just talking on all the different issues. Said, Stephen, we actually agree on 95% of the issues. Okay, there's 5% where we might have some sticky points, but let's start at least first dealing with the 95% that we agree on. And the first real issue we tackle, and it has to do with what you were saying about online and just somebody offering a service on the telephone, and it was called Uber at the time. And so the Uberization of the economy, and it's the very first thing Stephen and I did. We said, listen, we have to do something about this. If you have a profession that is subjected to rules and you have the same service, you need the same rules for the same service. You can't all of a sudden, because I have a smartphone, all of a sudden say, oh, by the way, I can be a taxi driver. I'm sorry, but taxi drivers are subjected to certain regulations, and for a good reason. They're for making sure that the driver is safe, the passenger is safe, and other road users are safe, and that taxes are paid. And so we teamed up, and we went to see the Director General at the time of the ILO, and said, sorry, you have to do something about this. This is a threat to the work contract. And we as employers and as employee representatives were against what is going on. And within that week, they had to come up with a resolution saying we cannot continue with the Uberization of the economy. Rules must be respected, and the drivers must be respected. So I think one of the good examples is when we work together and we actually have resolve, we can get things done. We can actually shake things up. With institutions that don't normally move so quickly, all of a sudden we can make them jump when we act together.
You have some comments?
Thank you. So really good questions. I think the ITF's position's quite clear, although we do have a relationship with Uber. So I'll start with what's clear and then I'll explain where it goes a little grey. The reality is we believe workers, informal or otherwise, should be treated as workers. And I think what we recognise, and again, Umberto, we go back to the pandemic, a lot of governments actually don't understand how their economies work, let alone transportation. So the reality is, if you don't have employment, you don't have social cost. If you don't have legislation for employment and then social cost, guess what? You're going to run a deficit. And, you know, when we talk about pensions and the challenges. So the reality for us was, how can we engage? So we met Uber after our first initial position. And at that time, pre the pandemic, 5.2 million workers globally, and not ITF, not in our 18 million. So that's a problem, right? Who's representing those workers? And the diversity from a New York cabbie to working in Pakistan, and a massive spread. And I think also recognition that, to be fair, the ITF has sponsored quite a lot of court cases, which are ultimately about legislation, and won a few, lost a few, as all good industrial union battles happen. And in the end, we decided, in consultation with all of our governance bodies, let's have a conversation with Uber. Let's agree that we don't agree about what is the employment status, because it's the fundamental gap between the two organisations, but then let different unions adapt inside their national legislation. So the first down the ramp was the Australians on the way to a Labour government. That may have been part of the initiative, but they agreed a representative model. And that's had, well, UK, a big court case, then Australia, and now we have one in Belgium, and we're in conversations running parallel. So when we talk about the European Union, I shall be very careful what I won't say. The reality is we're supporting the paper about employment status, but we're not quite sure what the end of the line will look like. So if we can secure good industrial relations where we've got 95% agreement, then we'll do that. And it's very interesting because guess what Uber want? They want a level playing field now. So I'll let you digest that one. So they recognise that having disrupted the whole of the market and changed the world as we knew it, now we want some consistency. Okay, well we can work with that, but you know, there you go, right? Market share and enforcement. So on that issue, and then on the question of skills, and I think, you know, we didn't touch in the first part, but I think we have to talk about the global supply chain. And, you know, we mentioned the bits that don't work. So, you know, there's no sanitation for many of the truck drivers. And where there's sanitation, there's also many unpleasant things that are not good towards their well-being and their productivity, let's just put it like that. So I think what we think, and we're advocating this incredibly strongly, clients of transport, those that are outward-facing, providing retail. We see way more retail on the internet, so the shape of the supply chain is constantly evolving, that it's critical that there's a human element. So for us, it's human rights and due diligence. It's a responsibility for every client that fixes a contract with a transport provider to make sure there's no human trafficking, there's no child employment in the production of the stuff that's dealt with. And this is a long game. If we start to get inside the head of the corporates that your reputation isn't just about the brand you produce, but actually how you move it around. So add that to the fact that we're talking to the other global unions about manufacturing and retail, there's a big space there. And of course, if we had the whole gender debate, half the world's consumers are women, and if you don't create equal opportunity for women in the workplace, would that change your mind about where you buy your goods? Maybe it would. It's a different level. So, and then just on skills, I think the technology, when I talk about fear, there's another fear about technology in the sense that product placement, so the creators of the technology are very good at putting out fantastic adverts about ships with no seafarers, driverless trains. Okay, so that's marketing as we know it in this current environment. But the knock-on effect of that is it destabilises people who are in the employment and massively discourages people who might become employed, because all they hear is this very smooth message that we don't need human beings. None of my partners on this panel agree with that. Everyone we talk to recognises there has to be humans in the decision-making element about the future of technology. So we say we should be at all these tables formulating ways of communicating to working men and women to ensure that they have an understanding of the challenges, and we can combat that. And the more coalition partners that say the same thing, the bigger opportunity we have of swinging the barometer to make the jobs more attractive. Some of the jobs should be way less physical. Some of the tasks that are super mundane should go and be resolved by digitalisation. But they won't be okay unless you sit down and discuss what happens to you tomorrow, but not just tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because Umberto's right, we have a massive age profile challenge in many parts of the transport mode, and it is shameful, I'll be much stronger, Sheila, it is shameful the amount of women we don't have in our industry, and that's because we've driven it down to a very hard cost environment. And now we're going to have to transition to meet these climate challenges from a very low place. And that's why we're kind of very keen to widen that coalition group and really put, and I think just one little go on trust. Trust is earned and very easily lost. Now, the ITF has put itself in spaces with its affiliates about climate, digitalisation, that is not popular because, you know, trade unionists are worried about getting elected. And if you don't get elected, you can't change much if you're not elected. And if you deal with the most difficult issues in our society, and probably these are in living memory, some of the most difficult issues, but the reality is you have to be transparent, you have to tell the truth, have to share the direction and the pathway of engaging, and you need to have more influence. And I think maybe post-pandemic there's a degree of anger in society which we haven't experienced before. We've never seen so many strikes in the global north and the global south because people are frustrated. So we have to take that frustration, we have to develop ways of communicating that make sure that the workers, but also the riders, the customers, understand that they're part of the solution. And that's our big challenge.
I think, Stephen, and I want to, Amanda and Sheila, if you also have so I'll turn to you very quickly. I just want to point out this one thing that comes up again and again and again when we talk about system change, technology change. And those of you who follow history know that, as I said earlier, transport has changed itself many times over the last 300 years. Every time people said, well, this change, this technology, will remove the need for humans to work. And every time they've been wrong. I'm not going out on a limb saying that with generative AI, with robotization, with automation, it does not mean that there will not be humans working in this sector. But they will be working differently, and hopefully there'll be a much broader representation. So Amanda and Sheila, again, we had these questions on trust, on the role of platforms and how they're disrupting the nature of work. Some takes from you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Amanda. So trust, massive, absolutely huge. And again, I keep reflecting on the same thing. We're all living in a world as well as working in a sector. And I think people see repeated examples of where good evidence about what actually is the case is being dismissed and replaced with hysteria in many ways. There's a great example in London where the mayor is developing an approach to low-emission vehicles, which is about saving lives, and no better way of describing it, and an approach to speed, which is about saving lives. You hit a kid at 30 miles an hour, you will kill it. You hit a kid at 20, it may very well walk away. The difference is huge. And these things being put in place, but they're being treated, and they're being exacerbated in a quite frightening way, in a culture war, as attacks on liberty. And I don't think you can divorce how people feel sitting in that from how they then feel about how they're treated at work and whether they trust what they're being told. Because Stephen puts it perfectly, if you're going to build a relationship of trust, you've got to keep it going. It's got to mean something. The people you're talking to have got to believe what you're telling them. And if we're told to believe nothing nowadays, except what we think or feel or see in some very limited way, that's really hard. And then you've got to come back and show what's got better, and you've got to be prepared a long way down the line to be able to show that the commitment was real. Otherwise, the trust, such as it ever is obviously going to evaporate. And I think, there are really very specific examples in the mobility sector, again, the foundation is working on, around things like the emissions of vehicles. So Dieselgate told us you can't trust what they tell you when they sell you a car. And a recent court case in Europe shows you can't trust them in Europe either. And we're doing on-road testing, dry as bones, very technical, very specific, which just shows that there are cars out there emitting 20 and 30 times more NOx, which is jolly bad for you, than they tell you. It's very, very bad for your children. It's bad for the baby inside of you. It's bad every step of the way. And so I think, there's a big question that our sector, just like every other, faces, which is this dismissal of evidence and instead a whole load of emotion or whatever that you want to call it, which serves a purpose. And I think in our sector, the more we can do to build a situation in which people feel they're being told truths and they can trust in them, then obviously it's going to be better, isn't it?
And clearly that trust, we're talking now about trust between those who move and use technologies and are moving themselves, and workers also have to have that trust.
That's exactly what I mean. Of course.
And that trust has to
Steve
be across,
expressed it. You've got to have a good level of communication.
Absolutely.
You've got to keep coming back. People have got to believe you mean what you say.
Amanda, we've had this first round of questions from the audience. Some of your takes on what it really, how you view the platform technology perhaps changing the nature of work or not, and this question of trust between employers and employees, those who are making the decisions and those who are earning the income and making the work.
I think they've tackled most of the issues. I'm going to comment on the trust building because I've been engaged in this process of building trust between government and public transport operators because they had a very bad relationship. One thing that we did was to get neutrality in the discussions, neutrality in the person, the professional that will engage the providers, public transport providers, and the regulators, government. And this person is experienced in paratransit management and transition to higher capacity vehicles. So he would come and he would come to Uganda from Cape Town, and they listen to him because he has no interest on the ground in terms of provision of the service and regulation. He's just an expert. And he would speak to the providers, what they had to do, what they had to know, and speak to government, what they need to do, what they need to stop doing. And we earned a bit of a good platform. Myself from the academia, also from the university teaching, I was trusted to steer that process, because an academician is just someone who is sharing knowledge, who is speaking from that point of view, is not having any interest in the regulatory side, but is telling you the truth. So we had to open up this discussion by telling them, please, one rule is transparency for both sides. Do not tell lies. 2, you must commit to this process. 3, it must be consistent. You mentioned that as well. And somewhere along the way, they presented the public transport plan, and these public transport providers asked, how did you come up with these routes? Who gave you this information? There are no passengers here for the bus. We also never get enough passengers. And what do you mean by feeder role? Feeder, we are going to feed into the main network. Which one is the feeder and which one isn't? Because this route actually feeds the other one, you know? So they started sharing real information that government did not know. But along the way, about 2.5 years after those discussions, someone spoilt it, because they introduced some 5 buses along a certain route, and they had licenses. So these other providers were asking, how did you issue the licenses to our routes? And what does this mean for the future of our vehicles, our fleet along that route? Shall we lose it? And they said, no, we don't understand. We thought government can be trusted, but now that they have introduced these buses, it means there is something cooking behind our backs, and we need to know the truth. So that is the stage where we are at, to try and regain the trust, because that puts, and no one is owning this. The city authority says, no, we don't know who issued the license. The ministry is saying, we don't know who issued the license to those buses. And the local governments are also saying, we don't know who issued the licenses for that route. So you don't know where to start from. And there's some animosity coming up from the old providers between them and these other ones. And they are on the same route. So I think it requires consistency, and it's a work in progress continually to see that government has to be more open. And also, when we invite them to meetings, you see that these providers keep time. They come 20, 30 minutes before, the room is full. But if it's government, 2 hours later. So they are more ready to engage, and I think you've experienced this as well. So yeah, I think trust building is a consistent, continuous process, and there has to be neutrality in the process management.
So respect.
Respect, yeah.
Key takeaway, you heard it from Amanda Gabriano, governments, get your act together. All right. Before we go on to another round of questions, I also want to say that I heard when we're discussing the Uberization or the arrival of these new types of work arrangements, one thing that strikes me is, yes, the legislation that's in place, for example, that puts in place the rules around taxi operations and the rules around formal paratransit, et cetera. Those are important and therefore a reason to protect workers, to protect the industry, protect the market, if you will. But those also change. And so there is, at some point, there is this tension between the strictures of legislation and the need to identify what are the fundamental principles that legislation should bring forward. For example, having a living wage, being respected as a worker, having a fulfilling job. And it's sometimes there's this imperfect, messy space when the legislation is maybe no longer fit for purpose, but has to adapt. But we should always keep those principles in mind. Those are the principles that we have to deliver to the workforce going forward, always. And when we move away from that, then we're failing the workforce and we're also failing society. All right. Rant off. Question to the audience, and we're going to talk about something that has been brought up already. But my question to the audience right now is, what is the largest transport service in the world? The largest transport service in the world. Any ideas? Yes?
Other people.
Okay, so good one. So people delivering things to others. Okay, that is a really good one. Any ideas? What is the large? And this is, by the way, not based on anything other than a really gut feeling on my part. So, but a well-founded gut feeling. So the largest transport service in the world. We heard yesterday. I don't know if in the plenary that when families have children, women's transport number of trips goes up by 23%. The largest transport service in the world, I'm going to say, is probably families accompanying their children. And in most cases, it's women accompanying children. That is the largest transport service in the world. Now, it is unpaid, it is often unrecognized, and it's invisible. But it prevents 50% of the population, at least those that have children. It is one of the things that are the structural reasons why women find it difficult to participate in the workforce, because they have to do this unfairly and not their spouses. So the question I have is coming back to this question of gender participation in the transport workforce. How can we address some of the structural reasons why it is difficult for women to participate in the workforce? And how can we address some of the other issues in that they are not being brought into upstream the training programs, the schooling programs that would allow them to have the skills to be able to contribute to this. So how do we change the way in which we arrange ourselves around the skills, the opportunity for 50% of the population to be actively involved in this essential field? Sheila, I'll turn to you because this is something that, and you're holding the mic, and then we'll go around this way, and then we'll come back to another round of questions from the audience and a final round on good examples, because we need to finish on a positive note. So Sheila.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a tiny challenge back, which is I'm quite sure an awful lot of men are also taking their kids to school, but the concept in relation to women is a good one. It's one of the many things which already is reflected, as you say, in the trip pattern of women, which is usually small trips, linked together chains, as they're commonly called, whereas most transport planning is predicated on in-out journeys at certain times of the day for what is a much more traditional and male-dominated way of moving about. I mean, so very much of how we plan our transport stems from, the standard man, as it were. There's no such thing as a standard man, but the standard man, from crash test dummies to everything else, that is the approach. So I mentioned it. A really important thing, I think, is understanding that. So taking your gut feeling and understanding it in much more clear terms. And so we did do a piece of work, supported a piece of work called Counting Women, so Women Count. And part of that is using new technology to, for example, analyze those trips on a gender basis. So much data that is collected is not even gender disaggregated. So that'll tell us a bit. And then I think, it's a challenge that runs through every aspect of female engagement in the workforce. So some things are very generic and very common, and we've touched on them, the provision of services more broadly that make it possible for women to work on even close to equal terms. So flexible working, good childcare, provided in a way that treats and pays the people who do the childcare properly too, be they male or female, and so on and so forth.
Equal
Those
pay.
things. Forgive me.
Pay.
Equal pay, absolutely, yes, absolutely. All of those things, of course, they apply, and they free women up to do other forms of paid work. There are those who'd argue you should work out how much taking your child to school is worth and then pay them. That's the whole paying women for housework, as it were, used to be called. I think it's a bit old-fashioned, that debate. I don't know anymore.
We can call it essential work.
Essential work. I'm going to get mired in all the wrong terminology. As I understand it, I wasn't able to be there. There was a full debate about feminism at the TUMI conference the other day, so I don't want to kind of get bogged down in that. But yes, so there are lots of things. Some are generic, some apply to our sector, some, like better data collection, are really helped by technological development. And then, as Steve and you've both said, there are ways in which the sector can make itself both more attractive and live up to that promise through training, through accessibility, through activity against the sort of glass ceiling, so women can move up through the sector as well. So I think those things are all pretty well known really now, and we've touched on them already. I just wanted to make one more point though, which is I think what we need to acknowledge here is, as well as the skills and the fairness and all of that, is that women being more represented, particularly in shared mobility, such as public transport and so on, is about sustainable mobility, because we, women, generally decide the mobility patterns of our families. So frankly, do we take our children, when we take them to school, on a bus if the bus is crowded and feels very unsafe? The bus charges a different fee every time I go, and that's something that emerged in a piece of work we just did with Girl Effect on women accessing sexual and reproductive health services and the challenges they faced. And do I do it if I'm going to be harassed on that bus? And I don't think anyone cares. If I say I won't do it and I can't tell my kids not to do it, they are being pushed towards personal mobility, they're being pushed towards cars, and we're undermining sustainable mobility. So we matter in so many ways, and I think you've sometimes got to make those links and not just think it's about fairness, as it were.
Absolutely, and to the point of the specific discussion on the workforce, why would they identify with that as an area in which they would like to work if they already feel as a user of that service that they're not welcome?
Exactly.
Roberto,
Exactly.
Maybe just getting back to your point about the most used transport service, and maybe this you can help scientifically corroborate your statement. You said it was 23%.
I said when families have children,
yes,
then the women's trip making increases by 23%.
23%. Well, I'll give you the example in Geneva. On Wednesdays, when primary school, there is no primary school on Wednesdays, it feels like there's 23% less traffic. So there you go. You can use that as scientific corroboration.
And just to the point that that is de facto women taking those trips.
Yes.
It is not right nor fair that they are the ones making those trips.
But that means they're on the road taking their kids. And it makes me think when I was in Canada, rather than that, we had these yellow buses that would bring us to school rather than having our mothers have to bring us to school. So there was actually a system put in place. And since I mentioned Canada, you hear from my accent, I'm not from here. I started driving at 16. And that's one of the big issues that we face in particular in Europe, in that drivers have to be 21. And so if you're out of high school and you say, what profession am I going to join? We're trying to get now legislation to make it so you can be 18 and be a commercial driver, so that right out of high school, you can choose the profession. But then how do we get women into the profession? Well, I'll tell you the challenges. And there are two big ones. The first thing is, in Europe in particular, we have driving and rest time rules that force you to have to stop after so many hours. You have to stop, and you have to ideally stop somewhere that's safe and secure. We don't have that many safe and secure parking lots. So you're going to tell a woman, come join this wonderful profession, and then you're going to get to hang out in an unsafe parking lot with a bunch of testosterone-enriched guys. Okay? It's not going to happen. How will you want to actually go that? You'll say, oh, okay, I'll just do some daily trips, domestic, I'm not going to do anything international. And then if you do want to do the international, you're going to go to a border where you're not going to wait a couple of hours. You might end up waiting a couple of days. You might even end up waiting weeks to get from one side of the border to the other. As a woman, you want to hang out at a border for 2 weeks?
Anyone. Would you want to hang out at a border?
Does anyone want to hang out at a border for 2 weeks? I'm sorry. And if you look at more fundamentally, when you have all these trucks that are stopped there, what happens? You create an environment that is conducive to corruption. And then we have the audacity to talk about sustainable development. So you have the trucks that are blocked, so economic development stops. Social equity, the drivers are held hostage. In terms of environmental protection, the trucks are just inching ahead. burning fuel for nothing, just because we're not efficient. And yet, we have systems where we send information to the customs authorities in advance. The IRU itself spent hundreds of millions of dollars to put in place a system where we communicate with customs saying, here we are, we're coming, this is what we have, this is what we're carrying, this is where we're going, this is where we've been, and you know us already from last week, we did the same thing, and yet we're stuck at the border. Why don't they just say, we know you, we know what you're doing, we know everything about you, go. So we have all the means to actually fix the problems, and a lot of it has to do with digitalization. It has to do with political will. Get it done. You want to talk about environment? You want to talk about sustainable development? Do it. Stop talking about it. Do it. And that's why at the COP, we need to bring this to the attention. Oh, you're the transport industry. You're the biggest polluters. So can we talk? I'd actually how to fix this, and we have solutions.
Amanda, the deck seems stacked against having equal representation of women in the workforce. So there are these structural issues, there are these issues of pay, there's the issues of opportunity. How can you, from your perspective, how would you see us being able to practically start to move forward on unstacking that deck? How to make opportunities available more equally to women in the transport workforce, and a very different workforce in the case of Uganda versus other countries as well?
It's quite frightening because it's a men-only thing, kind of. Personally, when I'm riding my bicycle and I want to do maybe 50 kilometers, the only company I have is men. And I don't want to be with them for, no, not for that long, even where we will sleep in the tents or somewhere in the hotel, and I'm the only woman with a group of men. It doesn't feel comfortable also for my family. So I get what you're saying about the border issue. The other thing that I've experienced is the meetings. These meetings, it's the men that I sit with. I'm the only woman, and I'm talking to these men, the public transport operators in the meeting. And when they get angry, I don't know what to do, but so far I have succeeded in managing their anger, their emotions, and it's frightening. So when I see one woman present in the meeting, I'm happy. I feel, yeah, I'm not alone in this. The boardroom, or our boardroom, you don't see many women in the transport discussions. So I think to make it attractive is very critical, and make it convenient for women, make a system safe, but also professionalize it. I think if there was a formal arrangement of it's a respected job, it's a respected organization, I have my uniform, for example, I have my tag, I have my wage fixed, I have my facilitation, my allowances, I'm respected by the organization. I think women would join that kind of arrangement. Training is really missing as well. If we had training and organizations inspiring and encouraging women, especially from Africa, they should look at it as a job, not just as a service. It's a job as well. And I think women are missing out on employment. So to professionalize public transport is going to bring in more women on board. But also the last and first mile is something that is affecting both the passengers in transport and also the workers, because the women have to walk to the station where the taxi is or where the bus is, and usually if it's very early in the morning, it's completely unsafe for them to leave their homes in the dark, going to where the van is, where the trip starts from, the trip origin. And then the last mile, if they have to go somewhere else to their bosses or something, it's also discouraging them a little bit. We've seen pregnant women finding it very hard to walk long distances to go to where the vehicle is. And some of the vehicles are not in a good condition. You can enter with a high-heeled shoe. The shoe goes through the
through the floor.
Through the floor, and then she's driving and she thinks she's braking, and the shoe is, going somewhere else.
I kind of sense this is a lived experience.
Yeah, I know. So it's something that really irritates them, I think that we need to do training, but most critical is the professionalization of the industry.
That's really interesting because earlier you said that, of course, in many contexts, not just in Uganda, transport, informal transport, popular transport serves this essential need, and yet at the same time may keep women out of that workforce. And so coming to the kind of respect that workers get and the extension of that respect, not just in theory, but in real ways to women participating in the workforce, what are some of the ways that you see from the ITF's perspective on how to make sure that women are in the workforce and are respected as members of the workforce?
I think fantastic comments by the team. I think we have to lead by example, and some of our affiliates are still very male-dominated. So first question is, how do we create the environment for women trade union activists to have the confidence and security? You talk about safety, but it's in all areas of that methodology. How do we create the space and for them to build their confidence and to have a position of authority by right? And I think that goes across, you've identified the ministers. The ITF numbers of union leaders would not be that much better. It certainly is regional, because certainly if I attend any conference, one of the core issues is about space for women in transportation. And just done a Nordic one, there was a lot of women in the room. I did one in Germany, there was a lot of women in the room. We have some of our most dynamic activists in our African women, but it's still a cultural challenge to define some of our traditional transport jobs as jobs that women should have by right. And then you factor in all of those issues. We have a sanitation charter, it's the weirdest conversation. Our women's team, very, very good. They came to me 4 years ago and said, we want to run a sanitation charter, right? Like, it's toilet day. And I'm thinking, toilet day, really? We're going to have a campaign around this? Yeah, it was one of the most powerful issues for our affiliates, because everybody takes it for granted. If you're a bus driver, even in London, we let the bus driver, our offices in London so they can come and go. But the reality is it's not factored in. What are you going to leave the bus running on the side of the road? And then you want to create an environment for women, and we've had these conversations, terrible stories in certain parts of the world where how women are treated if you're a bus conductor, ticket collector. So these issues we have to confront. We have to acknowledge they're not good enough. What I will say, because we also need some positives, a number of the multinational transport workers recognise that it's just bad business not to create employment opportunities for 50% of our populations. How we confront it, again, in space, I would say, because I'm pretty sure governments are not going to have the answers, that employers and unions and workers' associations, where they're not unions yet, should be part of those conversations, because we have to create a secure workplace. We have to create more opportunity for women leaders, because confidence, and you said it very well, Philip, that if you are alienated from a mode of transport, you're never going to consider that as a career opportunity. Right now, we lost 25% of the civil aviation workforce. We can barely get back, and you all travel to get here, I guess, right? Thank goodness there's effective trains in Germany, but the reality is civil aviation hasn't responded.
Wait, was that tongue-in-cheek?
I'll let the audience draw its own conclusion, because some of my team took nearly a week to get here for a day, right? So the reality is, look, the answer to some of our challenges, going right back to the beginning, we have to recognise that our transport infrastructure was pretty threadbare. We have to recognise that we haven't invested in women, shame on us, and now what are we going to do about it? And in all of these bits, so we can talk about key performance indicators in emissions, but we say very strongly there's no climate change without social justice. And that conversation is that, where do you fit? Global South, global North, East, West, doesn't matter. You have to see that this challenge, when it comes to your society or your workplace, couldn't agree with you more. And unfortunately, we're living in a post-pandemic period when people are angry. There's a massive degree of cynicism when it comes to political leadership. And our job is maybe to forge practical, measurable things that people can see, that we believe in wage equality and that we're creating opportunities, and maybe we have to be more proactive in our investment in women into our environment, but we have to answer those fundamentals about their safety, whether it's from an occupational health and safety angle or actually from a personal element. So those things are the most fundamental. But I will tell you, we are challenging ourselves, and that's not easy. Challenging men, union leaders, to create genuinely more space for women to take leadership in their unions.
There is no human growth without challenging yourself, and that's true for organizations as well. Yes, very quickly. We only have 5 minutes, so very
Super quickly say, of course, we're, I think, really focusing here on the mobility service element, so the bus, the truck, the driven vehicle, etc. There's a whole part of the sector which is office-based, design, technology, new systems, all of that. Far less reason to have no women in there, but there aren't enough women in there either. So, just so it's not kind of directed just at our two colleagues here, but also, you know, there's less reason there. I mean, I've spent a lot of time with men, never felt frightened, but I do it in an office, you know, so why that can't possibly be unique for transport. So
hanging out in the right crowd. Very quickly, we only have 4 minutes now, and I'd like to see a show of hands of people who have something they would like to ask or say, and if for both. So we have one right here, and maybe I don't see any other hands, so we'll go with one, and then keep it brief as possible, because what I'd like to do is very quickly ask a final, very brief question to all of our panelists. So.
I need 2 minutes. I thought yesterday maybe we do not have enough content, so I have some.
So maybe half of 2 minutes would be perfect.
two fun facts that are not that funny. I remember 2016 going to Ertico in Strasbourg. So there they had a
Ertico is the ITS Europe Congress.
Yes, yeah. And they had a showcase, and the showcase was autonomous driving, electrification. Fun fact number one, a car should have taken the new bridge from Germany to France, and it was not certified, so no car go there. Imagine. Second one, they had a strike at that time. So I believed that the strike had to do with autonomous driving. Yes, because the perspective to have autonomous driving, to have ITS World Congress there, but no, it was, I would say, a usual strike, like to have them in France. You can put it in the calendar. And then what happened is the only possibility to go to the fair was a people mover that should be autonomous, but that needed a driver for security reasons. So one strike broker drove this car. And what I was thinking is, how can they have trust and how can they have a perspective if we talk about jobs maybe getting not used anymore? And so we ask young people to go there, and then we say, well, we are going to autonomous. So this perspective, and I can tell you one thing: you need a success story. And as I have not the 1 minute more, I have one from Canada, and we may discuss this later. But this is what we need, I think, and maybe you have one. And you got the point. We need to tell them, so we're not sorry, that they can be part of us. They start as a bus driver, and then they sit there where you sit. Or
Absolutely. There is mobility, upward mobility as well, opportunities in the transport sector, starting from the bottom all the way to the top. And hopefully, under this transition, as we go to net zero, that mobility will be available to many, many other people than it has been in the past. And that is my question, my final question to all four panelists. Very brief response. We talked about how transport has had to reinvent itself in the past many times. We're now talking today about how it will have to reinvent itself again in this trajectory towards net zero, and about what the workforce will look like, and how and who will be participating in that workforce. Do you think, and this is a very short answer, do you think we'll do a better job this time in bringing all workers along, giving respect that they require, and making sure that we have a much broader representation? Very quickly, are you optimistic about where we're going, or are you slightly worried or pessimistic? And I'll start with Amanda. Very short answer. Do you think we have hope, or more action that's necessary to get to that hope?
I think we have hope from the Ugandan experience, because we see that the public transport providers are willing to learn, engage, share. They are desperate. They don't feel firm yet to be as neutral as possible to engage with them. So that's a good outcome. That is hope. But also the public transport providers are looking at their business improvement model. And they're asking, can we be trained? Can we go to school? Can we have more women? I think this is good. For me, I think the biggest hurdle that we have is to bring the women on board. And when that happens, we shall know that we have achieved a measurable outcome in the improvement of the workforce.
So one vote for hope, not for fear. Stephen.
Difficult to do in 2 minutes and try to get 2 examples in. I'm optimistic because examples like this, coalition of the willing, different points of views, this is a wide debate. We have 2 examples. We're working with the International Chamber of Shipping, UN Global Compact, 2 ILO bodies, 2 UN bodies, IMO, International Maritime Organization, International Labour, about the just transition for the world seafarers. We've got statistics, we've got numbers. We're not quite sure what the alternative fuel is yet, but we're building the coalition with the existing workforce to eradicate their fear and get the employers to pay for their upscale training. So that's a clear positive. We have a partnership with the C40, which is Mayors for Climate Change, which I can't remember the latest number of how many cities are involved, but cities have enormous power. And they've agreed that we could be part of a process where we explore green union jobs, decent jobs, collective bargaining union membership jobs with women, with young people. And why I feel some degree of optimism, I'm pretty sure that before the year's out, we'll have a partnership with the IRU exploring what the future truck driver should look like, including all the elements we've discussed. The big challenge, lay down the challenge to governments to stop talking and start acting nationally, globally. I know there's a meeting this afternoon about what goes on the COP agenda. I want to echo Umberto's position. Okay, we're not perfect in transportation, but you've identified we're very resilient. We will continue to evolve to respond to the challenges, but then you've got to help us with money and rules that make sure that we can compete fairly and effectively with skilled, safe professionals, by taking Amanda's point, because then we will really make that difference. So for me, it's concrete outcomes.
Absolutely. Mindful that we're now over time and between coffee and our participants. Umberto, again, are you hopeful we're going to manage this transition better from a labor workforce perspective?
Be challenging, but I'm optimistic for 3 reasons. One, we have to walk the talk. If I look at our Goods Transport Council, so everything on freight at the IRU, our leadership, all women. The president, 2 vice presidents, women. Okay, so we're getting it right. My directors, half of them are women. So walk the talk. I mean, don't say, oh yes, everything equal. Make it equal. Secondly, Amanda, you were talking about professionalization of the industry. We worked together with the World Bank in Togo to professionalize the Togolese industry. We worked with the government. We made recommendations on how legislation needs to change to professionalize, to be able to train the workers, to make sure that the transport operators that are created, the companies that are created, are professional with CPC training, making sure the drivers are in. Everything was put in place. In the majority of the world, we don't have this. In Europe, yes, we know working time rules, all that. In the majority of the world, this does not exist. So we went in. Perhaps we can come to Uganda next and give you a hand. And the last item that makes me most optimistic is the partnership we have with ITF and with ITF. And based on respect and based on working together, we'll get it done. That's why I'm optimistic.
Super. Sheila, the last word to you.
You're not going to be glad you put me last. I'm not optimistic, no. I think optimism comes close to complacency sometimes. It certainly feels glib. I hear a lot of it. And I think it's viewed as being like good. You know, you've got to be positive, you've got to be optimistic, or somehow, I don't know, you're not on the train. This is massive. You know, this is capitalism at its greatest. We don't necessarily have the tools. I don't think we talk enough about how we're going to work through this culture war. And yeah, I mean, happy, clappy people go to the pub. Angry people make change. And so I hope that what we can work out is how to take the people who are frightened and angry and cynical and turn that against where it needs pointing, not against some of the action that's being taken, which is actually all to the good. So no, not feeling desperately optimistic on that yet, but great people around and about, lots of energy, and our young people.
I
That's
could
maybe
not
the
think
optimism.
of a better way to finish this discussion about how to make sure that this time we do it better. So with that, be optimistic, be angry, be activist, think about the future, and make sure that we act to make what happens. I'd like to thank all four of our panelists, Sheila, Umberto, Stephen, Amanda. I would, especially, we said at the outset, there are real heroes in this room this morning, and those are all of you who came at 9 o'clock this morning when you could have been still in bed. Thank you for participating. Thank you for, even though we couldn't turn to you as much as we would like, for having some comments and questions. And thanks, of course, for the technicians and everyone that made this possible. Enjoy the final sessions of our ITF conference. And then we'll go back to the OG ITF being the real ITF in the world. Thank you again. Thanks so much, Stephen. Pleasure. Excellent job. Grazie mille.